Hello everyone. I think while you've joined, you're already aware of the good work that ProThoughts is doing with the series of webinar with PMI. Uh, Thankful to ProThoughts for inviting me for this session as a guest speaker. And there's a very interesting topic that we have chosen for today's session. Is that does your project need a reset? And what are the practical ways to get back on track? The topic in itself is a very interesting topic as it deals with the practical side of how you put your PMBOK knowledge in practice and a day-to-day navigation of something that you don't plan for. And that is, I think all of you would relate to, is that not all projects, in fact, most of the projects do not see a green path throughout. There will be situations where the projects will be in trouble, and there is a difference between a seasoned project manager and an unseasoned project manager, how you pull out of that situation. So today, the session is of 1 hour, wherein we have divided it into 45 minutes of presentation from my side and then 15 minutes of Q&A. You all are invited to put your questions in chats that we can pick up towards the end of the session. Uh, the session would be structured with a brief introduction of what we would be covering in this presentation. Then a quick view on early signs, how you can gauge that your project is in trouble. Then I will take you through a detailed set of slides to see how we should diagnose on those early signs. What is the correct way forward? What are the practical and proven ways forward? And then a few slides on the recovery strategies. These are again practical knowledge through my years of experience, as well as the knowledge that we gain all together from the same book of knowledge. So let's dive into the presentation. The purpose why we are together today is, again, to summarize, I will impart you knowledge on how to identify the southward trend on the projects, whether projects are growing amber or red from green, share some proven strategies and ways of working that will yield you the best path forward. There will always be more than one ways to handle a situation, but there will be some proven strategies that have always worked and will keep working in some situations. And then when you walk out of this session, you would be enabled on how to recover and even how to identify those situations early in your projects. If you identify them early, you will be able to mitigate them proactively. Why it is so important that a project runs on track? Always, we see as a project manager, one key aspect of our life is to keep status reporting. Most of the project managers early in their life strive to put everything in green to their stakeholders. When they season up, they realize the importance of proactively mentioning the risks and issues and transparently report the status with amber or red. And further, with experience, we realize it is such a burden of responsibility that we carry that there has to be a perfect balance of what you report proactively is not in green and then guide it very swiftly with the satisfaction of all stakeholders towards a green light, which in itself is a sense of accomplishment, focus on project goals, project success. And that is what have been driving enterprises throughout the world to cover most of their important missions in a project mode rather than operationalize it. So with this background, we start with the first topic in our presentation is how to identify what would be those few early signs that you see if your project is in trouble. There could be many, but I have handpicked top four here. And these would not something that you would see in a report, but these is what you will realize and sense day to day when you're working on a project. And top of the list, mostly so in all the customer or client based projects, is a lost confidence of your stakeholder, your sponsor, your customer in your project. Very often they will not come and tell you that, but it will be very evident when you are on calls, the kind of questions you face from them, and how you interact with them, how they respond to your updates. When we dive deep, we will dive further into how to identify further, how to deep dive into each of these early signs. But this first topic of lost customer confidence is very, very common in the transformation projects world. It is something that is never a straight line in terms of graph. If you put it on a trend line, it is never a straight line for a project. There will be times where your stakeholder will not trust you. There will be times you will have to reach out to your stakeholder and customers to engage them proactively. There will be times you will have to prove your execution to gain their confidence. The second is team morale and ownership. As equal as a customer or a sponsor, the internal team is as important and equal in terms of managing stakeholders. And it is very important that you have your team alongside you with equal morale and ownership. Only then you can sail through the tough times on the project. So, again, this team morale and ownership is something that no tracker will tell you, no reports would tell you, but it is something that you will sense in your daily meetings, let's say daily stand up meetings, on who takes the ownership of the tasks, whether tasks are completed on time every day, whether your questions are being answered with practical judgment and ownership. The third one on the list is the declining quality. Very often you see that everything in the project goes right, you meet all the timelines, there are no issues, you are on every task is completed on time, and then on the most important milestone on when you have to pass quality, there is a delay. That delay happened because of the declining quality of the outcome of the product, and some cases the declining quality of project management itself. And that again, that declining quality early sign will not be visible to you in any report. By the time someone shows you that mirror, or your team members that mirror, it might be too late. And that is why an early sign of declining quality is only a project manager can judge with that bird's eye view that other team members don't have. The fourth and most important early sign is when there are frequent missed deadlines, and when in your risk tracker you have risk related to impact in terms of timeline risks. These are again very, very important early signs that will be visible to you if you are day to day very observant on what category of risks come to you, what are the respective impacts of those risks. But then if you're not on top of your game on that detailed tracking, analysis, and assessment, you might miss these early signs. These four, according to me, are the most important early signs that you can get before you walk into that trouble zone. If you keep a good eye on these four, you will probably be very proactive not to even let your project dive into that zone. So, what I talk to you, if we just rephrase those in terms of root causes, and that is how normally projects happen in at least 80% of the world, how they perceive if the project is in poor health. The root cause might go on to user acceptance issue, scope creep, execution delay, cost overrun, unhappy stakeholders. But then this is not the right way of doing it. This is not right way of diagnosing what is the root cause. This is a cause, this is not a root cause. So I will take you a level deeper, and that is where you as a project manager should be on top of your game to be in the details. The devil is in the details. If you are a project manager trying to diagnose what is wrong with your project, you will not just look project as a piece or an object. Rather, you will should have a KPI view on which performance indicators I should be looking into to find the root cause. One of those most important items is the project scope. So you should first look into whether your project scope is in poor health, and if so, what could be the root cause of that. If you do not have this multidimensional view or way of working, and you always look to find root cause at a project level, you will never have the right impact captured and the right remediation captured. So it is very important that we have this segmented and multidimensional way of looking at a project. So what you see on your screen right now is only one dimension that I'm looking right now is project scope. And there could be various reasons in a practical world where a scope can go southwards. The most important of it could be when we began the project, there could have been poorly defined project objectives. And later we realize that there are corrections and additions to it. Poor planning could have been an equal spoiler. Very often we see that project goes into a mode where there is frequent change additions. And by the time we realize that there are too many, we realize we should have a change management process from the first day. So that's a stage gate we build as a quality on our side as project managers that small or big changes, every change should go through a change management process from day zero. Poor stakeholder engagement could have been an equal spoiler. Many a times, and this is a reality in the real world, many a times identification of correct stakeholders happens through as you dive deep into process. Whereas by quality standards, it should have been a day zero activity with the correct stakeholder identification. If you don't have the correct stakeholders with you for every deep dive into the requirement of the process, you will not be able to engage with them. And such delays in stakeholder engagement, correct stakeholder engagement, will always cause a scope creep on your project. There could be multiple other reasons. There could be some projects running with resource shortages, some projects running with external factors impacted with external factors like compliance, etc., coming late in the game. And then also because of inadequate requirement gathering or inadequate scoping or inadequate budgeting on our side to start with. These are some of the common root causes why the scope of a project could go into poor health. Similarly, for the schedule, there could be multiple reasons, and I've listed a couple of examples also for the most important ones. Again, the shoulder of a project manager is something that is to be trusted with project schedule. You might have a long list of team members who might come with competencies that you're not equipped with, but you have the responsibility that every task that they have to perform should be planned with the correct estimation of efforts. Sometimes it is easy when you have lived through all those years doing the same kind of projects again and again. But when you're in new territory, that is when the correct work breakdown structure becomes an exploratory activity which might involve some level of research also. Very often it happens that our WBS is not of that detail. An ideal WBS on a project plan should be at least of 4 levels. Very often we see when we create tasks, they lack interdependencies. A common myth in a project management world is an interdependency between the task in a project schedule could only be finished to start. If one task ends, other should start. But that is not the case. The reality is that there could be four kind of interdependencies: start to finish, finish to start, start to start. finish to finish. And all those dimensions need to be put into picture when if you have to guide your project with a in a good health, with your project schedule not being impacted with things turning southwards. If we do not have experiences with what the team members are supposed to do, we do not have experiences on the same kind of projects, it is also a common spoiler that there might be sometimes unrealistic timelines captured in the plan. Sometimes it is also because of assumptive efforts. Project manager do not consult their team members on what is the effort required. And sometimes it is also because we use the approach of top-down scheduling. That is, we see what is the effort required for a top-level task, and we break down in that in terms of schedule for the lower-level tasks. Whereas the best practice, it might be little time-consuming, but is the bottom-up scheduling. You should first break the task into absolute detail, capture the schedule and effort and dependency for those lowest level of tasks. That is the recipe for success. Again, there are some common spoilers. Whatever is the uh, KPI going southwards is change management process. Always so important. External factors, unforeseen events that could anytime pull your project southwards. But then we'll dive deep further in the slides on how to come out of those. But then these are something that is high impact and low control areas. Similarly, project quality, it goes into poor health. There could be multiple factors that you see on your screen. But one important factor that I have seen occurring most in my career is unclear quality objectives. Very often you would see the quality objective in an organization or in a program would often be defined as one size fits all, be it a construction project organization, be it an IT project organization. The quality objectives, they always try to build a book out of it, a one size that should fit every kind of project. And that is the start on when there is an unclear quality objective on your project without considering the nuances of scope of the project, without considering the nuances of the schedule of the project. The quality objectives are so important. If, for example, if we are in a construction company and we are doing a project, the quality control measures, whether you are commissioning your project in a monsoon season in India or whether you're commissioning your uh, building in the winter season in India, might vary completely. There would be additional checks that would come into picture. Similarly, in case of IT projects, if you're doing a project with a low code, no code technology, or if you're doing a project with the scope of integration of legacy systems that are on premise, the quality control and assurance task will differ to have respective nuances taken into consideration. And so the right objectives should be set from the start of the project. Similarly, there would be again few common factors across all KPIs, some external factors that you cannot control. Resources are also top of the game, the lack of stakeholder engagement, inadequately trained resources, and again, root of all of it, poor project planning. So while we saw some of the most important and frequently occurring root causes, the world is not limited to this. There could be more in the real world, but I just captured what is frequently occurring and common across industries. Now, the most important topic in this session is what strategies we should adopt if we are in this zone where our project is not in green. project is in trouble. The first and foremost, for any strategy that you adopt, that is a parent strategy, that if you want any action on your project to yield an outcome, to pull it back from red to green, you have to have a KPI based, quantified monitoring and controlling process. And it is never too late to put this into picture. It is very common across the failed projects, the poorly performing projects, that these KPIs are not taken into consideration. Rather, it's a single dimensional project management that goes on. And three very easy examples that I could give you and how we apply a strategy to change it is: number one, very often when we prepare the status reports, whether the project is a red or a green is a single dimensional reporting happening. Most of the project managers, when reporting their project not being in good shape, they're only concerned with the schedule, whether they are behind time or they're ahead of time, whether they are matching timelines or they're getting delayed. I'm not telling that everyone does that, but that is a very common symptom that we see in the monitoring and controlling phase of the project. The easy way out of it is always have a multidimensional KPI based reporting, something that we covered. And what we see on the right hand side on your screen is these five KPIs of a project. If you take it into consideration, if you monitor them, if you control them, each individually with a different lens, with as a different dimension on the project, it is very easy for all your actions to give you a good return in terms of project progress or pulling the project in a better health. Because it is very important for someone to identify the cause and the problem if you want to remediate it. If you're shying away from identifying what is the cause, where exactly is the problem, you will end up remediating everything, giving more efforts than required, but you might not be touching upon where the disease is. So these five KPI, I'll just repeat it in sequence: scope, schedule, budget, quality, and stakeholder satisfaction are the most important indicator that you should capture in your multidimensional KPI based reporting. And this does not have to be a science. This is something that everyone can put in their template of reporting. If you're doing a traffic light reporting, you can do a traffic light reporting in all of these factors. Talking about traffic light reporting, coming to the next uh, common disease across projects is we often have a qualitative scale of reporting. That is whether the project is red, amber, or green, and we try and define it. A red and an amber could be a delay or at risk, and then a green would be no delay. But then again, that again pulls us to a single dimension, that also pulls us not to have the view, a quantified view on how much the project is deep into trouble. A project that is delayed by 5 days will also be a red in your reporting, and a project which is delayed by 25 days would also be a red on your reporting. So that is where quantified scale of reporting should be adopted. How much or how many days is your project aging in red? How many days is the delay? Each of these KPIs, when you monitor them, when you control them, always have a quantified view. Once you adopt this quantified scale, you will know the momentum in which the project is going southwards. You will know what should be the effort you should put, whether is it a fresh southward trend or is it going since lot many days, and what is the effort you need to put into. What is the level of strategic approach that you would have is defined by this quantified scale of reporting. Similarly, the third most common diseased area is that when project managers prepare a project plan, often it is the most important artifact when we start the project. But then, few months into the project, 30% downtime down the line in the schedule, we often lose reference to it. It just becomes a reference document on what the schedule should have been and not a live document. Much often, with agile coming into picture, project plan have been open to a lot of revisions. But then we could hide a lot of things by moving from one sprint to another. But in the end, the last sprint will always put you in a bad light. So that is where revisions to a project plan, it's happening. Everyone is doing it. But there is a better way of doing it. Most often people do it reactively. Yes, I'm over budget. Let's rebaseline. Yes, I'm behind schedule. Let's rebaseline. But that is a reactive way of doing it. The correct way of doing it, the right strategy to do it, is a proactive rebaselining. And that will only happen when you have those early signs in your project. If you know the trend in two sprints is a burnout, that you are moving 20% of your task to the next sprint, proactively rescope and rebaseline the project plan and the scope of development for next two sprints. That is when you will be able to pull it back. So, per my experience, knowledge, and peer talks, this is what I've gathered, that 50% of your project issues, risks can be put down. You can recover from them if you have a KPI based monitoring and controlling. You can then have those early signs for you to take timely action. Then we come to those factors that we just saw on the root cause and diagnosis slides. One of the most important performance indicators for us as project manager is the scope. Very often we see the scope just keeps on changing. If you are in a construction industry and let's say you have built an airport and your customer doesn't like the entry gate of the airport or the outer look of the airport after you have commissioned it, it's a huge scope change. If customers in an IT industry project keep changing their requirements every other day, it's a huge problem to remediate. But then there are a few proven strategies that I put on this slide as example. There could be more. But then the most successful and easy way of doing it out of all these that you see on your screen is resurfacing the project scope. By resurfacing, we say is that in a gathering, in a meeting with all your stakeholders, remind them, show them what is the original project scope. Very often, the scope changes are not intentional, rather reactive. We in IT industry, or most of the people, when adopting agile, we try and follow ceremonies like we demonstrate what is built in the sprint. While our intention is also to gather feedback, there is a limit to which you can gather a feedback without impacting the project scope. And in that happy engagement zone, there will always be some scope creep. The good way out of it, don't say no to incoming changes. Be very polite with your stakeholders, but always politely put forward what is the original scope. If you see the tap is just not closing and there are frequent changes, the other way out would be reach out to steering committee. It's always there for your help. You're not just reporting to steering committee. They are on the steering. And you could always propose a project scope freeze. In worst case, if there is not a scope freeze, you could always propose a backlog to be maintained on what could be delivered outside the scope in an outside of current timeline, that even a subsequent phase. And one thing, as I always say, from day zero, something that is your best friend in project management is change control. It will never let you down in terms of how you engage with your stakeholders, how you keep transparently resurfacing the project scope. In some situations where things are not of help, and let's say steering committee also ask us to explore that unknown territory and keep gathering the requirement and scope changes alongside because they are important. The next tool that we have with us is Moscow. So I'm sure you might all be aware of Moscow is that how you prioritize your requirements as must have, should have, could have, or would have, and do it transparently. And then you can ask your stakeholders, we could only go with must have or should have. You have to evaluate what fits in your schedule or what fits commercially. And there comes your next weapon. Every project has a commercial setup. It has an approved revenue budget. It has an approved cost budget. And every scope change should be evaluated with respect to a cost benefit analysis. And accordingly, the commercial setup on the project needs to be revised. If it is an agreement and funding driven project, the contract should be revised. If it is a fixed price project, probably the revenue setup needs to be revised. If it is an internal sponsored project, the resource allocation needs to be revised. So there could be multiple ways of handling it whenever there is a scope creep in the project or sometimes a continuous scope creep in the project. Two of most used uh, strategies, especially in the IT industry, are breakdown of large project into smaller sub projects. That always a weapon you have if there is a continuous influx of changes in scope. If your project is of let's say 4 to 5 months of project, you cannot just keep doing a project for entire year. There will come a time where you have to take a call. This is what deserves to be a project with the initial estimation of complexity and size, and this is what can be broken down into subsequent projects or sub projects. Very often, when there is a scope creep, it is not always the person providing the requirement that is at fault. It is also sometimes that project becomes so big that they are no more manageable. And it is an important skill in a project manager to identify what is the t-shirt size that the project fits in. And if you do not fit in that t-shirt size anymore, it is time you decide that this needs to be a separate project or a separate change that could be handled in a separate sprint or even a separate program. But you have to be vocal around it, you have to be analytical around it, and all these you will only get if you have early signs on your project, if you can gauge those early signs on your project. Another most used strategy by the transformation and IT project managers is very often we reinvent the project methodology. Something that started with waterfall turns out to be agile. Something that started as agile turns out to be hybrid. Something that we might be running in agile, we are forced to take a stage gate approach midway and turn it waterfall. Many project managers do not employ this considering They think there is only one way of doing a project that's given in the charter, but the reality is the project is always open for reinvention if you have your stakeholders' acknowledgement and your sponsors' acknowledgement in a steering committee driven project, if you have your steering committee acknowledgement. If you employ or trust only one way of doing a project, you are still in old school. You can employ 10 different ways in 10 different parts of the project to guide it to success. If you see, for example, you're running a waterfall project and the defect are just not dying and there is lack of happiness, I mean, lack of satisfaction in your stakeholders on how you're reporting your defects, you can use a Kanban methodology to show the status of the defects. If you think being agile is just pouring in scope and changes in your projects, you can take a stage gate approach and move on to next phase. There can be a mix and match of methodology. That is the revelation. While these are again the most commonly used strategies, most proven strategies, I would say, there could be more. If we keep on discussing, and time would be less to cover that. The other most important uh, early signs and factor that we consider is when delays start creeping into our timelines, or there would be delays, uh, there would be risks that would be running towards delays as an impact, and that will make us think. So, what strategies we should adopt then? Few to quote here. It is a daily activity, and especially when we see a scope or a delay creep in the project, we need to coach the RACI to all team members. We need to make them realize they are accountable for what and responsible for what. A project manager is responsible and accountable on the overall project, but deep down on every task, every team member has to take the accountability, and that reminder has to come very often whenever you see anything going southwards. And you should not hesitate to remind people of that. You should try and resurface that tracy matrix again and again in the project on who owns that piece of delay. A very good way of doing it, which is very feasible in an agile or a hybrid project, is to conduct very frequent lesson learned workshops. Is that when you get time to take a breath, show upon what went wrong, even what went good. Again, a misconception with lesson learned workshop is that you only touch upon what went wrong. The reality is you should often touch upon in lesson learned workshop on what went well. Try and replicate it. Try and make it a model in your upcoming projects or upcoming phases. That is when the more frequently you will do a lesson learned workshop, the higher will be the curve of continuous improvement. It is very important that you monitor and analyze the burnout of your team members. Have a detailed tracking on what they are delivering and with what rate and velocity they are delivering. If it is fitting in the scoped schedule or is it overflowing? That burnover, that monitoring and analysis will always yield you a direct action to come out of the delays and a direct root cause. You should always be aware that you have all the power in the world to re-baseline and reinvent the project plan midway. Of course, it should not be a one-way activity. Stakeholder engagement, proper root cause analysis, and a backing up with a risk and an issue should be there to support that decision. And the decision maker in respective project setup, whether it's a board or a steering committee would be, or a sponsor would be the decision maker to it. But he would not have the insight to take the decision unless you provide them. So it is very important that you identify those early signs and then proactively put forward a re-baseline or a revised project plan to re-baseline. The Moscow and the change control are the two good friends you will ever have in a project to come out of the burning situations. The revelation that we just had that we could use multiple methodologies, we can have a change of methodology midway in the project to guide it northwards is also one of your good friends and strategies to come out of the grid. Again, when we see delays, one of the common root causes is that the project managers are not in control of the project. And it has nothing to do with one skill. Sometimes the project becomes mammoth in terms of schedule or scope that it is no more manageable with that set of team members or with that capability that we've got. And that is where we should not hesitate to rethink of what fits in the t-shirt of that size and complexity of the project. With all this said, one of the most important tip that I always use in my projects to come out of delays is to have an effective rate tracker. A tracker that gives you risk, assumptions, issues, dependencies. And the most important thing to do in that, the tip that I'm going to share with you, is always have a named owner on every item in that tracker. Very often, getting into the stakeholder management mode, a project managers takes a softer approach in calling out names on the root causes, on the issue, on the risks. That is where you should remind yourself that you're accountable, not just responsible on the project. And similar reminder you need to pass on to everyone. You can only do that when you name them. It has to be a polite communication, let's agree, but you should never hesitate. Always when you note and track raid items, many people just track it, but then while tracking they forget the purpose of having a rate tracker is to have mitigation and resolution plans. And a plan, by our definition, what we have been doing for ages as project managers, has to be a time boxed. We often take down actions, but we forget to give a time expectation to it. And then I come to the most important set of remediation strategies. This is something that you would not get in a book of knowledge, you would not get in a charter, you will not get in an organization training. Something how to recover if you get poor feedback from your stakeholders. This is almost a no recovery zone. If your stakeholder has lost confidence in your projects, how do you come out of it? The most important starting point is respond calmly and constructively. A poor feedback is not end of the story. A poor feedback is only riding at the back of a thought process that someone is not in control. Your actions should demonstrate that you are in control. And if you do not respond constructively to a poor feedback, probably you are showing that you're not in control. But it's always important to acknowledge and listen to a feedback, not just respond to it. Once you've got a feedback, always follow up and follow through till the end so that you show that you're even in control of the remediation action taken on those feedbacks. This could be done very transparently while you learn, improve, and you show to stakeholders that you're learning and improving. And that can be done by publishing the lessons learned. So that proactive engagement on every feedback is very important. But then there could be projects where there could be multiple stakeholders. You cannot just go on justifying and working on actions and lessons and feedback on every single stakeholder if there are 20 stakeholders. That is where a man-to-man marking strategy is important when you manage stakeholders. And that happens very early in the story. When you're preparing a charter, you would also prepare a stakeholder register. To take a note, who are the primary stakeholders, who are the secondary stakeholders. Feedback from primary stakeholders would matter to be resolved. Feedback from secondary stakeholders would be taken as good to have inputs and not necessarily be worked upon. And then every stakeholder needs to be managed in the project. There should be an ear to listen to each of them. If you think you have too many stakeholders, divide the stakeholder management amongst your team. That is where man to man marking on a stakeholder engagement is very important. Handle each stakeholder differently. Every stakeholder should have a feeling that he is heard. So, such preparations of engagement should be early in the story where you have a stakeholder register. You should know who would be responsible for managing the stakeholder and what will be your strategy to manage the stakeholders. Some stakeholders, as you learn about the stakeholder, would need an ear to listen, some would need an action, some would need a status. And accordingly, you need to learn by updating that stakeholder register as you progress in the project. Sometimes not all the feedbacks are correct. And in case you feel the feedback is not correct and not truthful to the charter of the project, you should resurface the RACI tracker again. The RACI matrix will give them that this is a conflict. This is a deviation on what we aimed to do. And then the feedback need not be action. Resurfacing the RACI in a steering committee call or in a response politely or an email could iron out the differences. That being said, I have covered a lot of strategies, real world examples, situations on your day to day projects where you can come out with, how you can come out with. There are examples and there are some proven strategies, but there could be more to it. Many of the people on the call would have experienced something larger than I have experienced in life. So I'm open to the inputs also. But this is basic. This is not a science. This is something as project managers we learn, we imbibe, and we demonstrate to others on the project. The most important food for thought as we come towards the end of my presentation is while we cover the remediation, the first half of my presentation covered on how to monitor early signs. And slowly, when you will remediating one after another project situations, you will be so skilled that you can avoid them before they occur. If you just have that school of thought, you follow that school of thought of KPI based monitoring on and controlling on a project. Some of the tools that PMI gives us is, and the most valuable of them is earned value management. You could monitor your schedule performance index. You could monitor your cost performance index. For larger projects and larger programs, you could even inbuilt into dashboards with ready reporting. So I'll just cover the last three summary lines to close my talk here and then jump into the Q&A. Always remember providing early warning signs is something that you can achieve with a quantified way of reporting and management. Yes, there could be things that you capture on what you sense, what you feel on things. But if you do not have a structured way of reporting, a detailed way of reporting, then you might miss on those early signs. You should always facilitate proactive decision making. All those remediation that you do, if you do proactively, you will be much more respected. And then the more and more you resurface the scope, you resurface the RACI, you resurface the actions on the rate tracker. These are your tools, your weapons. You will inculcate a culture of accountability and transparency. You will no longer be perceived as a troublemaker, rather you will be respected for bringing in burning things early to the table. With that, I complete my talk here. This brings us to the end of this session. I hope every one of you learned something new and would be interested to network further. I hope this series that ProThoughts is conducting on such practical topic continues. Thank you, Namita, and thank you, everyone.